As of today, Sunday, the 28th of June 2020, more than 10 million people have been reported with having COVID-19, of which more than 500,000 have died. This means the percentage of people who have been recorded as having the virus have had a 5% chance of death. 5% certainly does not reflect your chance of death, since it's now been reported that up to 80% of all individuals diagnosed with COVID-19 may show few symptoms or be completely asymptomatic. In this video, I interview respected fitness, health and wellness practitioner, Dr. Ryan Penny of the Wellness Brothers, to run through who is most at risk of being severely affected by the virus, or even being a part of that 5%, and why many of these underlying markers can be addressed by activity and nutrition, and how fitness truly is the cure. All right, welcome Ryan, and thank you for joining me today. So, research and studies conducted by the World Health Organization show that people diagnosed with COVID-19 at highest risk are men aged 45 and older, women aged 55 and older, smokers, people suffering from high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes type 2, people classed as obese, or anyone with an underlying respiratory issue. Now, you can't change your age or even your gender biologically, and if you are fit, active, and healthy, you may still have some underlying respiratory issues. But today, I'd like to discuss how inactivity, poor diet, and smoking lead to obesity, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and other heart disease, and how these issues open you up to a greater chance of death if infected with coronavirus, and how fitness truly is one of the best things you can do to significantly reduce your risk. So I'd like you to take it from there.
Well, yeah, I pretty much agree with everything that you've said so far. When we look at the information that's out there, obviously if you go back probably 6, 7, 8 months, none of us were predicting this. And now we're confronted with something that pretty much has turned the world upside down. One of the things that I absolutely love is something that you point out there. It's how is it that people can go ahead and reduce the risk? In my opinion, from the get-go, I said that the likelihood is we're all going to get it. And I still believe that. I believe that we're all probably still going to get it. And the thing that I was suggesting is, yes, if you can go ahead and provide some sort of barrier method, whether that is, cleaning well and keeping your hands away from your face, all the things we recommended for so many years, fantastic. But if you do get it, how can you try and reduce your risks? How can you try and ensure that you recover as well as you possibly can? And in essence, as you pointed out, how can you avoid dying? Well, we're not in control of all of those things, but we can certainly be responsible for the things that we can control. And those are the things that can produce or put us in the best possible state of baseline health. Another way in which we could put that is say, how can we make sure that we are fundamentally or foundationally in the best metabolic shape that we can be? And the simple reality is those risk factors that you included, those are things, as you've said, we can actually influence, and in so doing have certainly direct the probability of our recovery if and when we do get this particular thing. Let me point out the kinds of things that I think will be helpful in our discussion. At that particular point, and this was, I think, beginning of April, towards the end of March, beginning of April. And the idea at this particular point was everything was focused on the virus. So this particular section up here. And when I went and sort of re-looked at this, the question was, is there one virus or are there different strains? So at that particular point, I said, well, we don't know. Is it the same? Is it different? Let's assume we're dealing with the same strain. I'm of the understanding right now that we might be dealing with 3 different strains, maybe more, but the probability is that's going to change. So there's not a whole lot that we can do. I know there's a big push towards the vaccination and that, but that's on hold. What do we do now? So I was looking at the situation and say the first step obviously related to how could one sort of put a barrier between the individual and the virus? In other words, how did one avoid contracting it? And those were the things that the government's put in place: lockdowns, masks and gloves and sanitizing and all those things. How effective they are, really not the point of this discussion. Bottom line is those things have been helpful in some ways and they've created problems in other ways. As with most things, there are help hurt in just about everything. So the question really in my mind was, what was the difference between the people who were getting the virus and dying, those who were getting the virus and, you know, suffering significantly, they had sort of a severe condition and sort of lingering symptoms, which we know is the case, and those who seem to get it and be, you know, mildly symptomatic, if not asymptomatic, and just cruise on, which we know now is seemingly the majority of the people.
Yeah.
And it really, really came down to, in my thinking at that particular point, and I think all the evidence is there to support that, is, as I said, this baseline health. In other words, what was it that made this particular person here the one who would be a high-risk individual? And the things that we've found are the things that you rightly pointed out. People with what we call comorbidities. In other words, they had other problems in association with the infection. And the ones that I remember, a diagram that came out from Italy pretty early showed that people with a single comorbidity, you know, were significantly more at risk of dying. People with a second or a third comorbidity was very, very high. And the people with no comorbidities was a very, very small chance that they would, you know, suffer to the point of death from this particular thing. So the idea was, okay, as you said, can't change the age, can't change the gender. The simple reality is males seem to be a little bit more susceptible to the severity and death than females. But the older you get, the greater your risk. So how does one sort of work around those things? And the idea was, again, if a person could improve their fitness, if they could sort of lose weight, why? Because there are about three things that we know, certainly from the weight perspective, that might be contributing to increased risk. The first thing is increased weight is pro-inflammatory. So the guys are looking at the moment and saying, if you've got a BMI of over 28, which realistically is not that high in the society, the average American BMI is 29 plus, right? So you're looking at that and saying the majority of people, that's the average, you know, the majority of people just being of that particular weight or having extra fat are at increased risk. So why? Because it's pro-inflammatory. It seems that where there is an increased risk of inflammation within the system, there is an increased risk in relation to the virus. The second thing relates in many respects to the actual accumulation of visceral fat or fat around the heart. Cardiac fat seems to be a potential risk, which is higher in people who are carrying excess weight. And then even some of the obstructive type patterns that fat could have on breathing. So these are some of the things that they're saying, well, that could relate to the fat, the overweight side. We know that hypertension, we know that diabetes, which are both linked with being overweight, those three things run together. As with the other cardiovascular diseases, there are a cluster of risk factors that can all be influenced by, in essence, how a person eats, how a person moves or doesn't move, how a person supplements, how a person sleeps, how they manage stress, all of the kinds of lifestyle issues, which is why we looked here and said, if A was a barrier, well, B, this section here is how do we promote healthy living? And the idea is if we can, through healthy living, improve baseline health, we can move people from here to here and hopefully here. Now, that's going to take some time, depending on where the person's starting. But the idea is, what can a person do to move as far over to the right of this diagram as possible? And those are the kinds of things that you've been promoting for as long as I've known you, in terms of fitness and in terms of eating well and in terms of these kinds of things. So as we've said, the bulk of the risk factors that are not age and gender related relate very, very much to a person's way of living. So if we're able to go and improve that, it makes total sense. And I think a tremendously strong case can be made for the fact that if you're going now, as the lockdown sort of lifts, if you're going to increase your likelihood of contracting this condition, how can you do that with the greatest level of responsible safety? And that's going to come down to following the kinds of advice that people like you and I are going to try and offer and try and promote, which is eat well. And from my perspective, you and I have discussed that many times in the past, is going to be eat a good variety of clean, whole foods, plant strong, mostly raw, in quantities that get you towards the weight that is more healthy.
Love it. One of the most powerful nutrition sentences ever.
Right. Lots and lots of time to think about how can you put it into a simple statement that works in every situation. So I think the evidence is even there now to say the things that you and I discussed however long ago it was, a year or 2 years ago, those things will remain true because it relates to how the human body works. That's not going to change. So the very things that we would be talking about to say, how do we reduce the risk of obesity or the complications, or how are we going to reduce the risk of diabetes or high blood pressure, or even some of the bigger ones in terms of the chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, those kinds of things. There's always something that you can do to improve where you're at. The degree of improvement, well, that will depend on many of the other factors, but this is really where I think people need to be turning their attention to saying, again, I need to eat better. When it comes to movement, I need to make sure that my physical activity levels are up there. And I know you offer the kinds of classes and that where people are not, they don't know what to do. They feel they need that extra motivation. They want somebody who's professional who can advise them and help them. Well, you're making those kinds of things freely available, and as are others. But the bottom line is you need to move more, and you need to move more often. We know that that is fantastic for reducing stress. There's no question that fear has consumed many people through this time. That stress and that fear heightens the body's stress or physiological stress response. We know that that has an immunosuppressant action that further compounds the problem. In fact, let me just throw in one thing that I found particularly interesting as an aside that ties in with that. Was very, very interesting that they found that the death rate or the risk of death is closely associated with the degree of pollution in the area. And what they found was the people in China, those who were at great risk of dying were those who were, again, exposed to these very highly polluted areas. Since the lockdown, those areas of pollution have reduced dramatically to the point where nearly 1,000 people a day are not dying from the pollution. So in essence, you've got COVID, ironically, having produced a response, saving lives. Yeah. So that's a collateral beauty. And I think some people have looked to try and find, well, what are the good things that come out of this?
Yeah.
That's all great. And I strongly encourage that. But at the end of the day, the best thing, we can't remain in lockdown. So the reality is pollution is going to return. Yes, we can try and do things better, but everything is going to return to, I hate the term, but it's thrown around there, the new normal, which is going to involve all the kinds of pressures that take away from the things that contribute to better health and well-being. So the summary in many respects is you need to get from this purple guy to the blue guy to the green guy as best you possibly can, as fast as you possibly can. And you need to stay there in many respects until you probably get the condition. And then hopefully survive it well and then continue.
And have changed your lifestyle to one that is long-term and one that you can continue to action for the rest of your life, ideally.
Absolutely. And again, the basic things we've just described address high blood pressure, they address diabetes, they address weight, they address so many of those things. And so many of those things reduce stress and improve sleep. And it's a package deal, and it's a cascade effect. So you're trying to produce a positive cascade. And again, I think when people see it, hopefully just in a simple diagram like this, it's additionally motivating to go and make the kinds of changes that, as I say, you and I and others are going to recommend.
Ryan, thank you so much, my man. Always an absolute pleasure running through these things with you. You definitely simplify them, and your wealth of knowledge. I mean, you're always my go-to wellness guru. So thank you so much.